This meeting is being recorded.
Can I just test the sound, Chris?
Good morning. Good morning in Australia. Good evening to those joining us from the US. I'm Christina Talaco. I'm the CEO of Coalition for Conservation. I'd like to start, as usual, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm speaking from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So all over the world, governments are taking decisive action to curb carbon emissions and to transition to cleaner sources of energy. And Australia is no different. Our country is deeply decarbonizing its economy. But the premature closure of coal power stations means that Australia may lose up to 80% of its baseload power by 2035. And the current government is aiming to reach 2050 with solar and wind. But outside Australia, most countries embrace a diversified energy mix, and that includes cleaner alternatives like renewables, natural gas, and nuclear power. So nuclear energy is helping the world decarbonize, but Australia is not part of this trend yet. In fact, all 4 IPCC pathways to net zero include nuclear energy. So is it time that we consider here the possibility of nuclear forming part of our future energy mix? But assessing nuclear energy in Australia, in our context, requires us to learn from other countries and from others. So today, we have the pleasure of hearing from 3 experts in the nuclear field. Firstly, I welcome the Honourable Geoffrey Merrifield. I met Jeff last year at COP28 in Dubai. He joined our C4C event with the United Nations. And Jeff is the chair of the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council. He's a former commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, legal counsel of the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and he brings more than 30 years of experience to the discussions on nuclear energy. He's also the energy section leader at Pillsbury Law Firm. We also welcome Helen Cook, principal of GNE Advisory. Helen is a leading authority on civil nuclear law and policy. And a very warm welcome to my friend, Dr. David Gillespie. He's the federal member for LEAN and an advocate for decarbonizing regional Australia with nuclear power. David has been all over the world studying advanced nuclear technologies, and he will give his feedback on his learnings. So I'll kick off quickly by inviting Jeff. He will give us an overview of the energy landscape in the US. He'll talk about advanced nuclear technologies, the federal incentives that they have in the US. Then we'll hear from Helen on major global projects, followed by David on his learnings. And after that, we'll ask questions to the panelists, including those questions we received already from those who registered in advance. So please do type your questions in the Q&A box if you have questions for us today. We'll try to address all of them. If not, we'll get in touch with the speakers later, and I'll send you the answers to your questions. So, Jeff, welcome. We'd love to hear from you. At the end of the session also, I'd like to introduce Sarah Lolick, who just joined our C4C board. And Sarah will be just doing our final remarks and giving her input because she has a lot of experience in the energy markets as well. So, Jeff, the floor is yours if you'd like to maybe share your presentation.
Yeah, Chris, thank you very much. And before I jump into the presentation, a real honor to be here with all of you today talking about these issues. And, you mentioned the issue of bipartisanship. I first started working in Washington, D.C. back a long time ago, 1986. And nuclear wasn't a bipartisan issue at that point, nor was it in Canada and other places. But I will say it is strongly changed and is a very, very bipartisan issue in Washington, as well as Ottawa and in London and elsewhere. So I think we are seeing quite a bit of a trend internationally in that regard. I'll talk about that, and I know Helen will have some good insights on that as well. Going into the slides, let me pull this up. All right. All right, can you see that? Terrific. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. But just for those who aren't as familiar with nuclear power, just to do a little bit of a baseline, we do have 417 nuclear reactors.
Sorry, Jeff. Can you put it on PowerPoint presentation mode? Slideshow, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. So just to give you some sense of where we are, there are 417 nuclear reactors that operate worldwide in a diversity of countries, and they do have excellent operational performance, certainly in the US, 95% operation performance. In terms of advanced reactors, and that's the heart of what part of the discussion today is, I think for those who aren't familiar with it, I just want to go in and describe a little bit of what some of these terms are to give folks a little better understanding of what we're talking about. Microreactors, these are reactors that have fewer than 25 megawatts electric. Smaller scale reactors are between 25 and 300 megawatts. And the large scale reactors begin at about 300 megawatts and above. Most of the reactors currently operating around the world are what we call gigawatt size, which is 1,000 megawatts or more, and we are seeing a trend toward the smaller reactors. Sometimes we also hear of these discussed as SMRs, and this really refers to the way in which they are fabricated and constructed. Many of those are light water reactors, which most of the reactors around the world that operate today are cooled and moderated with light water, otherwise simple tap water. The technologies I think we have going forward are more inclusive. They do include some such as high temperature gas reactors, some which use liquid to cool them, liquid metal to cool them, and molten salt. These are all designs that were originally developed in the 1950s and 1960s, but because the US and others wanted to go first with light water reactors, they didn't get the attention at that time. But going back to those technologies, we realized that they have some very evolutionary and innovative capabilities that could be very advantageous for decarbonizing hard to deal with industrial applications. Here I have a slide that just mentions some of the representative technologies. These are not all of the advanced reactor developers out there, and this is admittedly a very US-centric slide, but it does talk about a number of the designs at the top: NuScale, GE, Westinghouse, and Holtec, all of which have what are called light water reactor designs. So this is similar in nature to what is currently being deployed in the United States. You have some which employ high temperature gas, X-Energy, that received a major award from the US Department of Energy. TerraPower also receiving a major DOE award. That one is a sodium fast reactor. And then other reactors that are smaller, some with molten salt, some with some combination. So a diversity of sizes, a diversity of technologies, and with that brings an ability to meet a much wider demand for potential applications, and I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. Some of the advantages, besides their size, the size does help to simplify construction. They do have a lower accident risk, and my former agency, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has determined that for many of these reactors, rather than a 10-mile emergency evacuation zone, which is required currently at U.S. operating sites, these designs could have an evacuation zone as little as 1,000 yards. They're emissions free. They do have load following capability. There's a lot of discussion about using them to repower existing fossil fuel sites, both coal and natural gas. And they have attributes which allow them to be utilized for a variety of industrial applications, as well as desalination, hydrogen production. One thing I would mention on the slide to the right, this is a pictorial from California. It shows that during the middle of the day, in the middle of that curve, significant amount of generation from solar, beginning at about 5 o'clock at night. That rebounds when people return home, open their refrigerators, turn on their air conditioners. And so there's a dramatic ramp up in power demand, which requires a lot of natural gas to meet that. This slide talks a little bit about the cost issues. I think one of the things which sometimes is confusing is the notion of a simple comparison of nuclear power versus wind and solar. And this is not at all intended to be a knock. I think we need them all. But I think you have to think of these assets in a different way. Nuclear power plants have an 80-year life. They have no backup power that's required. And so while they are more costly on the upfront, when you look at them over a long period of their life, they actually are, here in the US, for example, one of the cheapest forms of energy going forward in assets that are currently operating. Compared to that, if you've got to meet your baseload generation, which means 24/7 supply, that wind and solar is going to operate typically between 35 and 40% of the time. You've got to back that up with gas. Additionally, those wind and solar assets generally have a 20-year life. Backup bulk power storage typically has about a 10-year life. So there's a lot more kit you need to assemble if you're going to compare that with a single nuclear power plant, let alone some of the transmission issues that come with it that we can certainly talk about. In Canada, it's really a North American issue here. Both the Liberal and Conservative parties are very strongly in support of advanced nuclear reactors. Bruce Power, which is the largest operator in Canada, with 8 nuclear units currently, is ordering another, what will be the equivalent of about another 4 nuclear power plants. Other of the provinces, New Brunswick, Alberta, Saskatchewan, all considering deploying various advanced nuclear technologies. And Ontario Power Generation, which is the largest power company in Canada, has selected a design by GE called the BWRX 300, which they'll deploy at their Darlington nuclear site. So a lot of activity going on in Canada. Similarly, and I know Helen will likely get into more detail, so I'll go over this very quickly. United Kingdom has a strong, very bipartisan program. I think we'll see strong support with that, irrespective of who wins the upcoming election, with an intention to potentially put as much as 24 gigawatts, 24,000 megawatts of new nuclear by 2050, and with a number under construction. Poland, the Netherlands, Romania have all made recent announcements of either becoming nuclear power, in the case of Poland with a deal with GE, or in the case of Netherlands, which is going to order 4 new units in addition to one that they already have. Non-utility applications, and I think this is the biggest change that's occurred in the last year. Amazon Web Services recently signed an agreement to purchase 400 megawatts from an existing nuclear unit. Google, Microsoft, Nucor, and others announcing that they will be making the purchase of nuclear technologies and energy, or the power therefrom, in order to meet their needs for AI and supercomputing. There's a variety of different incentives that the US Congress has put through, and all of which have been approved either during the Trump administration or the Biden administration. These include direct grants, funding for nuclear hydrogen hubs, and then a variety of both production and investment tax credits to incentivize the construction of these designs. Finally, there is also money made available for the production of higher enrichments of fuel, for which some of these reactors will need, and activities to streamline some of the licensing processes are well underway. One of the things that these technologies enable is hydrogen production through the use of electrolysis. So lots of chemical and other applications that potentially could be touched by nuclear technology through pairing with that hydrogen electrolysis process. Finally, one of the things I think folks talk about is the waste. I would note here, nuclear power is used nuclear fuel is the most highly regulated metal in the world. I used to be a regulator, so I know that very well. No one has ever been injured or killed from the storage of that fuel. And as you can see in the lower left-hand side, that is a former nuclear power plant in Maine that was completely decommissioned. The fuel does remain. It has a very small footprint. One of the things that the US is looking at, again, is the potential for recycling that used fuel. I can talk about that in more detail, but there certainly are options available to us, as there are currently in France and in Russia. So with that, thank you, and I will stop sharing and turn it over to Helen.
Thanks, Jeff. So I thought I would start by painting a little bit of a picture about where Australia sits within the context of all the activity in the nuclear sector in the rest of the world, as Jeff has mentioned. So Turning to Australia, and as Chris said in her introductory remarks, we're in this unfortunate position of having prohibitions on nuclear energy at the federal level and also in some states. And I think these have caused a level of political inertia and ideological entrenchment of positions around nuclear energy. And if we fast forward to where we are today, and we have a look around the world at the other major industrialized nations, we see that most of them already have nuclear energy or are actively pursuing nuclear energy, or if they have no plans to, they are actually in a region where the electricity grids are interconnected and they have access to nuclear energy from other countries. So that's sort of the picture of the industrialized world. If you zoom in and you have a look at countries that are close to home, close to where we are, there is a lot of nuclear activity as well. So of course we have the established nuclear countries of China, which has the world's largest nuclear fleet build at the moment, and China is positioned to take over the United States as the country that has the largest nuclear power fleet in the world quite soon. We have South Korea, which is a nuclear energy nation, and we have Japan, which is a nuclear energy nation. Then we have these group of countries that are actively pursuing nuclear energy in our region. And I'll just mention a few: Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, all of which have very active nuclear energy programs today. And so when you step back and you look at the picture of the 32 countries that have nuclear today, the 50 countries around the world that are actively working towards nuclear, you look at the industrialized world that Australia is currently a country that fits within, and then you look closer at home in our own region. And I think that paints quite a troubling picture where we are as a country quite out of step with other industrialized nations and certainly our regional neighbours as well. So I guess that's the bad news. The good news is that also when I look around the world and I think about the 50 countries that are actively pursuing nuclear energy and think about the work that I'm doing with many of these countries to implement their new nuclear energy programs, I actually think that Australia is one of the best positioned countries, if not the best positioned country, to be able to move ahead, to be able to move forward with a nuclear energy program in quite a short period of time. That is if we can get over the political hurdle that is our current prohibitions. And we need to get over that political hurdle to be able to do the work necessary to position Australia to be able to have nuclear energy. As we know, we have some of the world's largest uranium deposits, and we send our uranium to power the world's nuclear power plants and research reactors as well. And because we do that, we actually have very stringent safeguards and security requirements that already exist in Australia, and we're actually considered world leaders in areas of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear security. We actually have 70 years of experience with nuclear technology in this country. We started our first research reactor in 1958, and today we operate one of the world's most sophisticated research reactors on the outskirts of Sydney. We also have an existing nuclear regulatory body in the form of our PANZA, with institutional capacity to oversee the nuclear activities that we currently conduct in Australia. And international peer reviews of our legal and regulatory infrastructure have said that it is aligned with best international practice today. We also know how to do mega projects in this country, and we learnt to do that. And of course, we have our AUKUS program right now, one of the most ambitious industrial and human resource endeavours to be undertaken in Australia. So if you put all of that together, I think we have a very solid foundation in Australia, and actually we're far ahead of many other countries that are moving towards nuclear energy. And I think that puts us in a very strong position. Now, also looking around the world and looking at how countries move from not having nuclear energy to having nuclear energy, it's a process that needs to happen, sure, and there is a lot of work to be done, but there are established roadmaps that countries have used and are using. There are tested paths to moving from being a country without nuclear to a country with nuclear, and there are countries that recently took this journey, like the United Arab Emirates. And there are many countries, as I said, 50 countries that are currently doing the work to roll out nuclear energy programs. And of course, and is clear from Jeff's opening remarks, there are countries that Australia would partner with, industries that exist that Australia would partner with, like those in the United States and Canada and the UK, if we were to work towards a nuclear energy program. So with that, I'll conclude, other than to say that the time for actually doing this work in Australia to give us the option to have nuclear is now.
Thank you, Helen. We'll pass it on to David, and then we'll come back to you. There's a lot of questions for you a bit later on. Welcome, David.
Yep. Thanks, Christina. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Well, it's great to be with everyone, and thank you, Jeffrey and Helen. I feel like the third wheel on a bicycle after all that jam-packed information. But just many of you have met me and other members of the Parliamentary Friends of Nuclear Industries. We were a bit of a closeted back alley organisation in 2 parliaments ago, but we've been out and about presenting things like this to fellow parliamentarians so that they understand it. In my travels, which have been to Canada, the US and the UK, a lot of things Jeffrey has already outlined, but the thing I might say is Canada is a great role model for Australia because we have so many parallels. We have a Commonwealth history. We both have King Charles III, or used to have QE2. We have similar governance, similar regulatory structures. They have a federal oversight of state-run or provincial-run systems. But Canada doesn't have this industrial cringe factor that like Australia does. We think we can't do something big like nuclear, but they are just like us, and they've done it all. And they have a giant of the most critical thing that I've found is anyone embarking on nuclear, sure, you need all the regulations and the bipartisan consensus, but you need a supply chain. If you have a supply chain that's mature and doing things and capable, you'll go well. And they have a very active, well-developed, multi-layered supply chain for all the kit that to build, to maintain, refurbishment, and they are using that to their advantage. They've also been through a very similar story to Australia. They had the Green Energy Act in the province of Ontario, and all the crazy things that you see happening here in Australia now, where you can just go into a local council over the counter, get approval to wipe out a couple of 100 hectares of pristine bush and have no discussion. The councillors don't even need to know in Queensland. It's all done. It's a clerical procedure. Well, it was like that in Ontario, and they had a real pushback like we're having now, and they realised they were sitting on the solution to decarbonisation. So they decided to refurbish their whole fleet, pretty much all of it, both the privatised section at Bruce Power and the Ontario Power Generation. They're ahead of time and they're under budget, and they're rearing and ready to go with a series build of 4 BWRX 300s. The other thing that we can learn from Canada is they have an excellent regulatory system. Jeff, I know you used to be a regulator, but it appears hindsight's always 20/20 vision, but some of the regulations were part of an agenda to suppress nuclear by regulating them to death and making it so laborious, and gas came along and outcompeted because it was quick and easy. So we can learn from Canada, and they are willing to help. They're helping in Europe with people in Poland, Czechoslovakia. They're doing stuff with Tennessee Valley Authority. They want to help us. The other thing that I found in my travels at this recent conference that Reuters put on in Atlanta, where I met Jeffrey, is the startup market for the small micro reactors is booming. there were several presentations from really scientifically endowed startup companies that have listed themselves, getting funds, are utilising both in Europe and in America. The other thing is a lot of American companies have used Canada as a test bed for the regulatory approval. They seem to realise the bigger market will be in America and the world, but they've gone to Canada because they have a great regulatory system and you can get something done. The other thing I learned was that it's not only just bipartisan. Canada has the same Indigenous paradigm in politics that we do in Australia. One of the drivers in Saskatchewan, which is a province just like South Australia, 1.2 million people, coal power stations, they're decarbonising, they're going to go nuclear. They're getting a micro reactor, the eVinci reactor, and probably have about 10 or 11 of them, maybe a dozen, around their frozen north. And the big drivers of it is not just industry, wait for it, it's the First Nations who realise that they can develop an economy if they have 24/7 energy. And the other thing is, what I've learned is the big push from data centres and the even bigger push from artificial intelligence data centres, where they think they will need not just 5 gigawatts of power to maintain artificial intelligence, they'll need about 15 gigawatts in the next 15 years. That's a massive expansion. So industry, not just heavy industry that can decarbonise, but the stuff that we all touch and the whole modern world runs on, is energy-hungry data centres. So I think what we need to do is keep educating the broader public, educate bureaucrats and politicians. I saw and heard on media this morning, almost like a mea culpa from somebody in CSIRO who's now acknowledged they haven't looked at nuclear properly. So we are winning, and if we can get our prohibitions removed at this next election, it'll be game on, because we will have a conga line of people who want to help and deploy the world's best technology. We can cherry pick the best of what's going on around the world. As you said, Helen, we have 80-90% of our regulatory structures in place. We wouldn't leapfrog, we do kangaroo leaps quicker than a greenfield nuclear country. We're very much a brownfield. We could do it so easily. That's my big observation. We need to become bipartisan. It's worked in the UK, it's worked in America, it's working in Europe. I got asked to go to another conference. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I've got Parliament, but there is a stampede in Africa. The third world countries realise, hey, we can get energy into our economy and we can develop like the Western world has. But Australia, we risk the situation of us becoming like those animals on the Galapagos Islands. We're frozen in sentiments in the community that were set in stone in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, where nuclear was existentially bad and there was this renewables only utopia, which people have swallowed hook, line and sinker. But the saviour of renewables is going to be a base load system built on nuclear. And that's how we need to get those people who are locked and loaded on renewables to make them understand that nuclear is their best buddy. Over to you, Christine.
I think you've done a great job. If I could add one thing.
Jeffrey, there's a bit of coming from your side. I'm not sure what's happened.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Better,
So I think that was a great overview. One thing I would add, going back to the U.S., and I rushed through it a little bit, is the industries that you really can't decarbonize with renewables. Dow Chemical, for example, has a high temperature gas reactor that they're putting to Texas. That is because their ethylene crackers need temperatures that can only be met either with natural gas or, in this particular case, a nuclear application. They simply physically cannot use renewables for that application. Similarly, with the data centers, what they're saying is, for AI, you need 10 times as much power as you need for a traditional data center. They cannot have any interruption whatsoever. So that nuclear generation, whether it's microreactors or, as I mentioned, contracting for that power from a larger nuclear station, that's all driven by the fact they can't change. And the final one I'd say is, and I think this is very applicable for Australia. Nucor is the largest producer of steel in the U.S. They have several sites that consume over 300 megawatts for electric arc furnaces. They really need that kind of large bulk power that nuclear provides in order to do that industrial decarbonization. And frankly, the renewables just aren't as good a fit.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, it seems like just renewables, wind and solar together cannot do all the heavy lifting, as you mentioned, right? Because there's, in Australia, much like in Canada, we want to decarbonize our heavy industry, maintain our competitiveness, and still be able to produce all the things that bring the dollars in. And to be able to do that in a green way, how do we do that? So yeah, that's a very good point. And I thank you, the three of you, for all your insights. I think the next thing we'd like to do now is have an interactive discussion. So to create this a more comprehensive sequence for the questions we've received. So I tried to arrange them in a logical flow to address everything step by step. So let's think about the nuclear situation into three different areas. One is obviously what we do in Australia is the comparisons and viability. So in terms of safety, waste, footprint, and cost, how does nuclear compare to other technologies, and why we should pursue the nuclear pathway and include it in the mix? Then secondly, there are some specific nuclear technology topics and questions. So, is there, what's the progress of SMRs? When do we see them coming into fruition? How long to build one? And lastly, the policy side and considerations. How do we overcome these legislative and regulatory hurdles? So I will start by saying that there's been a lot of questions posed by a report that the CSIRO put forward, the Gen Cost. Jeffrey, I don't expect you to know about this because it's happening in Australia, and I don't know how much you're following it. But I've already got 3 questions on the CSIRO situation, which are pertinent to the viability of nuclear and cost of nuclear. So basically, they claim that nuclear power is the most expensive form of power, and it wouldn't work in Australia because of that. So I just want to ask maybe Helen, David, and even you, Jeffrey, who has experience in terms of, overcoming the cost issue, the cost barrier. What do you think about the Gen Cost, and how do we change that narrative in Australia?
Thanks, Chris. Possibly David is going to have the most insights into this, but I'll just throw in my 2 cents worth as a lawyer, going into an area where I probably have slightly less knowledge, but this is a very well-known report. It's produced annually, and has maintained the same position on nuclear for quite some time now, which, as you said, Chris, it's the most expensive form of energy. I think 2 things. We need to make sure the nuclear inputs are correct, and there is concern because the data set that is being used to come up with these numbers is highly, highly limited. I understand it might even be based on one single project, which doesn't exist anymore, an SMR project. So we need to make sure the inputs are right. Then we also need to do what Jeff alluded to, which is compare apples to apples. And that is something that I think that we do not do enough, and we certainly don't do well when talking about nuclear energy. So we need to make sure that we're factoring in the 80-year life of a nuclear reactor versus the 20-ish year life of wind and solar. We need to make sure we're factoring in the always on 95% capacity factor that we get from a nuclear asset versus what we get from wind and solar. We need to make sure we are factoring in things like the cost of waste and managing an ultimate disposal of waste, which is something that the nuclear industry does very well and is legally required to do. That should be factored in. So, my two comments on the Gen Cost report are apples to apples, and let's make sure for once that we get a decent data set backed up by international examples that will spit out a proper reflection of nuclear. And let's also make sure that we're looking at not just the levelized cost of electricity, but also looking at a full systems cost analysis as well, which is something else that I understand is not being done in this context. But it is a very influential report, obviously. It is from the CSIRO, and I think, there's some work to do to see how we can get it to be an accurate reflection of the costs of nuclear versus other forms of energy generation. David?
Thanks, Helen. I just concur with what you said. People obsess, including the CSIRO, on levelised cost of energy. It's a very poor metric for the price that people or industrial users pay. The levelised cost of energy is...
Can you explain levelised cost of energy for those here who may not be acquainted?
The levelised cost of energy is a well-known parameter that looks at all the life cycle costs involved in a generation plant, whether it's a solar panel, a wind turbine, an open cycle or a closed cycle, gas turbine, a coal plant or a nuclear plant. And they then divide that up into price per kilowatt hour for overnight cost, building costs, or just equate that. But a levelised cost of energy is the price at the base of the wind farm or at the fence. Whereas the full system levelised cost is the delivered cost. The old saying, price at the power plant versus price at your power plug. A full system cost is what you pay in your business or in your home. And that includes not just the levelised cost of energy, which is the generation cost alone. It also has to have the levelised cost of 28,000 kilometres of new poles and wires. It also has to have the levelised cost of batteries, which cost trillions. It also has to have the levelised cost of pumped hydro systems, because when you have a renewables only system, you need all these double and triple and quadruple backup systems, and your grid costs, which currently are about 42% of your bill, are destined themselves to triple, quadruple. And, renewables, people love the concept of renewables, but they don't love the cost of intermittent energy and blackouts. And that's another cost. You've got to have the full levelised cost of blackouts in your figures when you are going to run a system based on the weather. And no amount of subsidies, mandates, or backdoor second income streams through large generating certificates and renewable energy certificates for householders will change the weather. No amount of subsidies will change day and night. And the topography and just the reality of where our East Coast grid, it runs north to south. And plenty of people have pointed out that there's months when we have huge problems with low wind and also things like weather patterns that coat the East Coast of Australia all at once. And many analyses, Electric Power Consulting, Robert Barr and Rob Parker's model shows the CSIRO informed by the Integrated System Plan are really underdoing generation, undercosting everything else. And so take-home message is we need to get people to understand, renewables are cheap. and they should be, because they only work 5% of the time or 20% of the time or 40% of the time, whereas a nuclear plant is green, is reliable, and has, over the whole life cycle and 80 years of operation, a much better full system cost of energy.
Yeah, let me add to that. I would say, there is a bit of cherry picking that goes on when you look at these issues. Now, I haven't seen the report, and I'm not going to comment on the originator of the report itself. But I would say, when you look at history, Germany has made an enormous investment in energy wind, where they're shutting down their nuclear plants, or shutting down. They were shutting down their nuclear plants and putting in significant amounts of wind and solar. And they've actually had to bring more coal plants, lignite coal plants, the dirtiest of them all, back online because they simply didn't have enough power. The price that the German people are paying for power right now is extraordinarily high. Their neighbor, France, which has 70% nuclear, has electricity rates they're significantly lower and much more reliable, and not depending upon other parts of the European grid to either ship in or ship out the power to meet their power needs, as Germany does. So when folks make these comparisons, I think they need to use a little bit of a broader net and really bring in a real world scenario. And I think Germany and France are a very good example of how not to do it and how it can be done well. The French used only a couple of designs. They replicated them over and over. They were able to get them to a price point that made sense, and they have a system that operates well.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeffrey. I mean, we're talking a lot about the financial cost. As an environmentalist, I'm worried about environmental costs as well. So that's an important issue that comes into play when we're talking about 100% renewables in Australia. So the photo behind me is the Moonlight Range, and the Moonlight Range is one of the most beautiful, mountain ranges we have in North Queensland. The photo that is there won't look like this in the future, because a wind farm is about to chop all the top of these mountains, and there's going to be massive change to the environment, to the habitats, and to this wonderful, which should be heritage here in Australia and protected area, will turn into a wind farm. There are currently 52 wind farm projects just in the north of Queensland, most of them actually on forest land and rainforest. So my question is, are we costing the environment into this? Obviously, the footprint of nuclear is a lot smaller, and that's not to say that wind and solar shouldn't go ahead. I believe that there's amazingly good quality projects in wind and solar, especially when it comes to areas where there's no, that there's not much forest or habitats, or there's in Australia, we have large areas like that. But unfortunately, these projects want to be close to the distribution lines, and that's why that they're being placed in areas that they shouldn't be. So if we move on to the environmental impact of other sources of energy that we're trying to create, how to balance that, but also there's a question of waste that is a lot of environmentalists are worried, and they don't support nuclear because they have misconceptions on how waste is handled, and the safety, also the safety aspects of nuclear. So should we touch on environment, waste, and safety at this stage? Who would like to start?
Well, I'll make a comment, Chris. What's happening in Queensland is an absolute tragedy. A lot of this is happening out of the public eye. It's so far away, most people in Brisbane don't know it's happening. But under established regulations, a wind farm developer, once you have the land, you can go into a local council, not have to put a DA in, and get it approved under code, I think it's number 63, which is just a clerical procedure. There's no discussion. It gets a leave pass to blow up. Steve Nowakowski, a former Greens candidate and Greens activist, has done an amazing expose of, there's about, I think with the roads, there's about 3,600 kilometres of roads that have to be put in, blow up mountaintops and lather the place with intermittent producing assets that cost a fortune for the grid to incorporate. It's a tragedy that they're destroying the environment to so-called save the environment. And we just got to get the word out that this is what you get when you have too many renewables.
One of the things I'll add to that is, if you look at the possibility, David, I think feedback may be coming from you. I think one of the issues out there is the ability to repower existing sites. There are a variety of fossil generating stations already in Australia, both coal and gas. Those are sites at which you already have the power lines. You already have a number of people who work there. You've got water in some cases for cooling purposes. A lot of the infrastructure can be repowered, and a nuclear unit could be located there within an appropriate size. And so you could be utilizing areas where those assets currently exist, potentially. And you also have an opportunity to allow the people who had worked at those coal or fossil plants to work there again. Now, on the waste side of it, anytime I do a seminar, the first question I get is, what about the waste? And frankly, I think the nuclear industry has an exceptionally good track record to show about the management of used nuclear materials. First thing with the plants, we've been decommissioning dozens of nuclear power plants in the US. We have locations where all of that material can go. And as I showed in the slide on my presentation, it basically goes back down to the circumstances where it was when the plant was first put together. So we've got well-funded plans and highly capable ways of addressing the low-level waste. In terms of the used fuel, admittedly, that's one that we haven't put a complete cork in. But I would say if you took all of the nuclear fuel from all the nuclear power plants in the United States over the course of the last 60 years, all the civilian plants, you could stick it inside the infield of a single soccer field, or football field, I should say, up to a height of about 10 meters or less. So this is not a massive amount of material. It's something we know how to manage. As I said before, it is very safe. No one has ever been killed or injured from the storage of civilian fuel anywhere around the world. We know how to put it in the appropriate containers to manage it appropriately. And there are a variety of technologies that are out there or are being developed, which could actually take the 95% of the energy that remains in that used fuel and put it back to good purpose in nuclear power plants going forward. So I think that's an area, technologically, I don't think it's an issue. There's some public policy issues that we're going to have to work our way through. But to say that nuclear doesn't know how to manage their waste, I think is a mischaracterization.
And if I could just go back to, I guess, and merge both of these issues together, one of the positives of nuclear is the density of the fuel. So uranium as a fuel, it's highly efficient. We don't need much of it to get a significant amount of energy, electricity from it. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, it means we need to mine less of it. And we have very environmentally sustainable and good ways of mining now uranium as well. But anyway, we need to do less mining to generate the same form of energy vis-a-vis other energy sources. The density of uranium also means that we produce less waste, which is to Jeff's point. And, just like Jeff said, it's the question that we get all the time, the what about the waste question. And it's really unfortunate that we don't necessarily have the silver bullet answer, because we kind of, from a technical perspective, haven't had to come up with the solutions, because we can store it safely, we can manage it safely on site, and we can also think about that spent fuel as a potential resource for the future. And Jeff might want to talk about this a little bit more, because it touches on, he mentioned reprocessing. We've got new reactor technologies that might be able to burn some of this fuel. So, there's a story to tell around it's unfortunate that we haven't needed to address the waste issue, so it's become a political issue and it's become an easy kind of target for nuclear. Well, what about your waste problem? But that doesn't mean that we don't have technical solutions, because there are countries around the world that are developing their final disposal facilities. They're opening them at the moment, and as I said, the spent fuel could also be a resource for using in future generations of reactors.
So bringing it to Australia, the question of waste is highly politicized, Helen. And yesterday we saw a social media campaign coming from a politician, a high-up politician, saying that nuclear waste will contaminate our waterways, for example. So how do you respond to that? And how do we bring awareness to the people that this is misinformation?
Yeah. I mean, we really do need to get out and start talking about this topic in Australia. And people like David have been doing it extremely articulately for a number of years now. But we need to do better, and we need to be reaching a broad segment of all of the segments of the Australian public to actually debunk these comments like this, which, you know, they're just not accurate. And this might lead into maybe, Chris, you know, the next topic that you wanted to address as well, which is safety. And as Jeff alluded to, the nuclear sector is one of the most highly regulated, if not the most highly regulated around the world. For good reason, most of the times, and then some people might say that we've even got to the point of overregulation at this point. But what does that mean? That means that we really do pay attention to these issues, and we're not going to see nuclear waste leaking into waterways. Now, spin it back the other way, and I say this with with a very strong position that I am pro renewables and nuclear for our future. But let's also talk apples to apples again here, and let's talk about potential leakage from solar panels, which we might not have as stringent regulatory requirements around yet. Potential leakage of toxic chemicals from solar panels into our waterways. Let's have that discussion too. Let's discuss all the energy options objectively. Let's lay all the pros and cons on the table. Let's look at the regulatory frameworks that we have. Let's look at the funding arrangements that we have for all of these different waste categories. And let's have an honest conversation about them. Jeff?
Yeah, I want to follow on Helen's point. I mean, I take a little umbrage with those kind of comments, because I spent 9 years as a federal regulator for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and we're quite proud of our track record of protecting the public health, safety, in the environment. One of the things I think, which is a very strong attribute of the international nuclear community, is the regulators all talk to each other. I mean, there is a regular conference that occurs every year in Vienna during the International Atomic Energy Agency General Conference, and they share best practices, and they're doing the things necessary to make sure that those plants are operated safely and meet those standards. I did have the chance to meet the chairman of our PONSO last September. Very impressive individual, and I think a lot of folks around the world, the U.S., Canada, the U.K., other folks in Europe are ready, willing, and able to assist for Australia to have a vibrant and successful regulator that can do what's necessary to make sure that the interests of the Australian people are protected. At the same time, they can move forward with the deployment of these very promising and important technologies.
Chris, I think the other thing people need to know, looking at all the questions that are popping up on my screen, is that we do, as Jeffrey said, we have a very mature, experienced regulator in our PANSA. We are signatory and have been part of the International Atomic Energy Agency since the beginning. We're part of the 4th generation nuclear reactor research forum. We have sat and had Australian regulators oversee the cleanup of waste in Fukushima. We've had them in all the international bodies. We have a very mature regulatory and safety record, bar none. We've managed to have over 250 nuclear visits by naval craft. We have protocols in place for that. And in terms of waste, Our ANSTO, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, has developed a final solution for high-level waste that can be no further processed, and that is the Synrock technology, which will give a permanent, reduced volume, permanent synthetic rock in which to store end of the life cycle waste. And any visiting nuclear operator or developer is all clamouring to find out about it, because it really is the holy grail of difficult to store forever high-level nuclear waste. So on many fronts. And the other question that's popped up, I see another CSIRO report saying that nuclear is 2.5 times more expensive, whatever. The capital cost of building a plant that runs for 80 years isn't what drives your costs up. It's all the grid costs that are the real killers. Your whole system becomes expensive when you have multiple generators with different frequencies, some DC, some AC, and getting it from the power plant to your plug is the really expensive thing. So for those people asking questions about, we can't build something that's more expensive. It is. Look at Finland. They had a very well-known massive build, a 1,600 megawatt plant. It took another dozen years and probably double the money. But now their electricity prices have gone down by 75%. They've been able to decarbonise a lot of their heavy industry, get rid of burning peat and oil to keep themselves warm. They've got industrial heat for their cities. It's a win all round. But don't confuse the initial capital cost with the cost of your electricity at your power point.
Thanks. Costs. Another question that is frequently asked in Australia, and Jeffrey, I think people have come to the conclusion that waste and safety, those are hurdles that, looking at what other countries are doing, the very low incidents that ever happened in terms of safety around the world, and also the new safety measures that advanced nuclear is bringing in, which will make it impossible for reactors to have problems almost. But so we go past those hurdles, and then we're left with cost and time. We're also left with questions here as to, in the US, I suppose Australia wants to see other countries like the US succeed in the nuclear SMR developments. So if you want to comment about where you see the first SMR popping up, and how do you see the costs going down? Because with modular, and being manufactured in factories, once these SMRs are licensed and the design is licensed, which takes quite a long time in that process, will that become faster, the production? Will it become cheaper? The supply chain as well, because one part of the cost that I believe that is not being factored in the renewables industry is that critical minerals, with the large demand and the amount of projects coming into the pipeline, the cost of critical minerals will also go up quite a bit. And that's not being costed in.
Yeah, as far as US, I think what we're seeing right now is I think some of the first that will actually be producing power are likely to be some of the microreactors. These were led in part because the U.S. military is pursuing that program with both BWXT and X-Energy. Those military versions will be producing power within the next 12 to 24 months. Civilian versions of those, I think, would be coming around relatively rapidly. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is already following the military program, so they understand the technologies, and those are particularly applicable for building in a factory-like setting. In fact, there are even discussions that they would build them in a factory, they would fuel them in the factory, and take them directly to the site. The U.S. military version of that is intended. It would be 2 cargo-sized units that you could put into a C-17, which is one of our larger military planes, transport it halfway around the world, and have it up and operating within 72 hours. So that gives you the kind of capabilities that are potential. The other two projects I think I would keep my eye on. One is the X-Energy site with Dow Corporation in Texas. That will be a high temperature gas reactor, and that's scheduled to come online in the 2028, 2029 timeframe. Similarly, in Wyoming, we have a former coal site, Kemmerer, which is being repowered by TerraPower, along with Berkshire Hathaway. That is a 345 megawatt sodium reactor, and that will be coming online in that same general timeframe, 2028, 2029, 2030. So we have a variety of those coming forward. GE, we mentioned Canada, Ontario Power Generation is looking to get their first ones online in that same rough period of time. And I think we're going to see other U.S. utilities lining up to try to get that on board as well. The one thing that's changed, I mentioned this, and then I'll stop, is there's actually discussion now, and this had not been the case up until very recently, of actually having some very large reactors potentially being ordered by utilities, other versions potentially of the Westinghouse AP1000 design, two of which, by the way, just started power operations within the last year. And that's driven by this whole phenomena of data centers and AI, which are driving huge potential increases in power.
Chris, if I could just jump in there too. I was up this morning at 5:30 a.m. Sydney time to be on a call with Dow. I work with Dow on the project that Jeff's talking about, and it's very exciting to be part of that project, and it's very exciting to be able to be involved in it and to think about what it means for a high temperature gas cooled reactor to come online and to be able to actually be used for an industrial application like this, and to decarbonize an industrial site. That's huge. It's super exciting. And thinking about the timelines that Jeff has mentioned, the late this decade for this next gen SMRs, and then into the early 2030s. That should be meaningful for Australia, because that means that if we want to be able to procure when these technologies actually are commercially available, once these demonstration projects have been done and we have operating reactors of this type and generation that are available for commercial deployment, we need to be ready to procure them. At least we need to have the option to be able to procure them. And that actually means starting to do the work now to get in the position to be able to. And I think importantly from Australia's perspective, it's also to just think about the supply chains and the vendor order books that are filling up right now as countries and potential future owners and operators of these reactors around the world are watching these demonstration projects and are actually either placing their orders or ready to place their orders now. The vendor order books are and will fill up quite rapidly. And that's where I think the prohibitions and the current situation we have in Australia does us a huge disservice, because we can't credibly contemplate proper engagement with any of these vendors so that we can have a conversation about a timeline to potentially get in their order books while we have these prohibitions and while we're not doing the work needed to simply give us the option to procure them later this decade. And that is something that really does keep me up late at night, being involved in these projects overseas and then thinking about the context of Australia right now.
Absolutely.
And I think you layer on top of that, the commitment of Australia with the AUKUS program to collaborate with the US and the UK in the deployment of Virginia class and other attack submarines. The fact of the matter is, for Australia to really get a larger value out of that, building the value chain, being in a position to supply more of those parts and pieces is going to be important. But I would also say, Australia can certainly send people to the US and the UK to get trained, but at the end of the day, after they've served the Australian Navy, where are they going to go? And so you've got the potential of a building workforce of highly trained individuals. The same kind of individuals in the US and the UK have really helped be a critical part of the civilian nuclear industry. And I think this is a great capability that Australia will be generating. And certainly, I think when they are done with their with their service in the Australian Navy, you want them to stay home, not have to go to some other country and lose that brain drain. So I do think holistically, there's a lot of opportunities for Australia to be considering this as well.
Actually, Jeff, sorry, Christine, just 1 second. That's a great point, because that was absolutely something that struck me during my 9 years living and working in Washington, DC, and engaging with the US nuclear industry, is the number of people in that industry who say, I'm an ex-Navy nuclear guy or girl. They're everywhere in the US nuclear industry. And if you look even to how the US nuclear industry started, to its very roots, they come out of the naval program. So, this intersection between civilian and nuclear, while from a legal perspective, we keep them very separate and we have our controls to make sure we got peaceful use in military applications, that's one thing. But the very practical point that Jeff made about the human resource development and the human resource capacity, and where are they going to go, and what are they going to contribute to when they come out of our AUKUS program, that's a key point. And they certainly, when they come out of the US naval program, go and contribute to the success that is the US nuclear industry.
David, do you want to make any comments? Because I'd like to go and also start talking about the regulatory condition very briefly, because we have to wrap up soon,
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, look, every system needs regulation. Our regulatory system is established. We've just got to add a few new layers and increase the reach of it. Our PANZA, the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, is currently the regulator for the sub-program. Eventually, I understand the desire is for there to be a separate naval regulator, maybe to fit in with how the US run. They have a separate naval or military naval regulator for nuclear versus the civil industry. We can start the International Atomic Energy Agency milestones process with the prohibitions still in place. We need to have a conversation with people to say we need to remove it. Someone questioned the federal government overriding the states. Actually, under the Constitution, that's why we have a high court, to sort out who has the powers for what. The Snowy Hydro scheme was initiated by the federal government after World War II to get energy security for the nation's capital, and also to help use electricity to pay for an irrigation scheme. But it was enabled by them under the Defence Act. And the states, Victoria and New South Wales, objected to it. They said, hang on, the Constitution says we run power systems, not you. And they said, well, look, we're doing this because of the security of the nation. So they started, and eventually Victoria and New South Wales bought on. Snowy Hydro is now owned holus bolus by the federal government because state governments wanted to get a big payday by paying out their share, and Malcolm Turnbull made it happen. But so we have got a federal vehicle that has power stations. It's called Snowy Hydro. But really, for the defence of the nation, it's not just having F-35s and missiles, it's having an industrial base. And for the defence of our economy, we need cheap, reliable energy. We want to make stuff. We've got to decarbonise our heavy industries, keep them. We can make a case that it's for the defence of the economy that we need to get the federal government involved in it. I think most people would feel much more comfortable, given the history of nuclear in this country and the significant community concerns about it. Having the government running it would be a much better, rather than the open market, anyone can turn up and build one. You would need industry, skilled industry, but like Ontario Power Generation, it's the second biggest power utility in North America, not just in Canada, in North America. They have, they are like the New South Wales Electricity Commission. Even Bruce Power, their plants are owned by the Ontario government, but they are leased from OPG. And the government did that to keep Ontario power generation efficient. So really, in effect, the whole nuclear system is owned by the government in Canada. That is another model that we could have here in this country. And yeah, I think regulation doesn't require any bulldozers. It's all paperwork. We just need to get the states on board because we want them to be willing partners. We've got one state that expressed an interest, but a lot of them have suffered, and this is something I might like to just put on the agenda. All these advisory bodies, AEMO, AER, the Energy Security Board, they're all the same people, and they have a duty to be giving government good advice, not cherry picking non-existent failed build outs as a price. They need to be giving advice. Yes, Minister, levelised cost of energy is the cost just at the point of generation, but the system levelised cost of energy is what everyone pays. That simple fact, it seems to have escaped many senior ministers at federal and state level. You know, the old saying, bull baffles brains. You know, people have got to realise our regulators, many of them have willfully led the nation up the garden path, and we need to start calling that out. And a lot of the environmental warriors, their position is totally conflicted because of their own personal significant investments in the system. And the funding stream for the renewables only build out is a significant lobbyist at state and federal governments. They have got their tentacles giving rose-coloured versions of an energy system through rose-coloured glasses. We need some hardcore reality at the advice to government level from these organisations, and I'll mention them again. AEMO, even CSIRO, like serious engineers are questioning, they cash for comment, or, you know, what's the story? So we need some hardcore advice explaining the limitations of the current plan.
Thanks, David. I truly hope that by, you know, through education and a pragmatic approach, that we will actually open up a pathway towards nuclear energy for Australia in the shortest term possible, because I do believe we will have it here. It's how long we take to start developing it. There's no way that Australia will be outside the nuclear pathway, in my view. And again, it's part of it should be part of the mix. It's not going to be the silver bullet solution and it's not for any country around the world, but it is definitely going to help with decarbonizing faster and in a cleaner way. So having said that, I'd just like to now call our C4C director, Sarah Lawley, to do some final remarks, because it's been a wonderful discussion and hopefully enlightened a lot of people. Sarah is a physicist, by the way. She's got incredible experience in energy markets. She's the head of energy supply for CDC, which is the Canberra data centers. And as you mentioned, Jeffrey and David, data centers are very interested in securing a lot of baseload energy, because in 24/7, and that's why they're interested in small nuclear reactors. So Sarah, I'll give you the voice, and I'll also ask you to after you finish, just to close the web.
Certainly. Thanks, Christina. Well, I just wanted to, I suppose I'd just like to start by saying it's a very exciting time to be working in energy at the moment. Australia's sort of been through this sort of process of, I guess, a couple of decades ago deciding that we wanted to decarbonise, but at the time not really paying great attention to what is the best way to do that, what's the most cost-effective, least environmentally harmful, efficient way of doing that. And it seems to me that, you know, there has been and there still is a significant amount of groupthink that Australia has suffered from. And I think certainly David alluded to that with some of those advisory bodies, those regulatory bodies. There is a significant amount of groupthink in that to date, the conversation hadn't really been opened up as to whether there are different ways of doing things. It had been assumed that we're just going to do this one way of doing things, and this must be the best way because it's the way we're doing it. And it's really pleasing to see that that conversation is, there's permission to talk now. The conversation's really opened up as to what is it that we need to look at. And even this discussion that we've been having today around CSIRO's Gen Cost report, it strikes me that this is the wrong report, full stop, in the sense that it's Gen Cost, generation sources cost, that we're starting with here. It should be SIS cost, system cost. It should be taking into account all of these elements: transmission, backup generation, storage, all the other elements that go into the cost. And I should even mention other fancy things like system strength and all the other things that go into providing actually a reliable electricity supply to the end user. So rather than Gen Cost, we should be looking at SIS cost, I think, in this country. And the other part of that is that the way, as Jeffrey was discussing earlier, the way that you think about this in terms of at what point are you comparing the cost? Are you comparing the cost in 20 years' time? Or are you comparing the cost in over the next 80 years or 100 years? Because depending on at what point you decide, oh, I'm going to compare how much money I've spent at that point, you're going to get a different answer. We're talking about investing in the future, a longer term investment than something that lasts for short term, 20 years, 25 years. This is a very different way of looking at things. Are you going to invest in something that lasts, or is it going to be more disposable and more waste, as was also discussed? So, yeah, in summary, I'd like to really thank the speakers, Jeffrey, Helen, and David, for sharing their knowledge today, and also for the people that are listening, that have joined this webinar, because this engagement is I think really opening up now, and it's really pleasing to see that people are actually interested in asking the question: has this been groupthink? Are we going about this the best way? And if it is, you can see, sometimes you see overseas, other countries who engage in groupthink go down the wrong path. And we might not be immune to that here in Australia. We could be making a mistake by just all singing from the same hymn sheet and not questioning, for example, things like Gen Cost reports, or even reports that come from AEMO. If we don't question and don't think through what are the other options, then we don't get the best outcome. So thank you for joining this webinar, and thank you to the speakers for sharing their knowledge on this. As I mentioned, I think it's a wonderful time. I concur with Helen in that I think Australia is very well placed in terms of existing capability. That's 70 years of experience already in operating nuclear reactors, and moving into the AUKUS space. The regulatory bodies that already exist are PANZA, which David called out. So yeah, I want to encourage everyone to stay engaged and to keep with us on this process of Australia kind of learning and opening their eyes a little bit to the possibilities here, because it's a really important point, I think, in our history, where we can be open-minded, or can be closed-minded. And I think that's going to cost us if we are closed-minded at this point. So stay with it and continue to be involved. That's my that's my 2 cents. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone. It was really quite a wonderful morning that we spent together. For you, evening, Jeffrey. Thanks for your participation and joining in from Washington. To be continued. I'm sure we will organize more events, and Coalition of Conservation. Just go on the website if you're not part of our group and sign up, and you'll receive the invitations for the next event. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely night. Thanks to the audience.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
being asked.